Then you have to embark on what one of my colleagues calls the holy hustle, which is you need to follow up and follow up again and be diligent. Is that you can't expect the world's going to come beat a path to your door, that you need to continue to be persistent. And some of those doors you're going to knock, and you're going to knock again, you're going to knock again, and that door's not going to be, and you have to decide how many times do you want to keep knocking. And while you're knocking on this door and you're waiting to go back and follow up next week with another email, go and knock on this door and that door and this door. That is, and then you will notice what starts to open up for you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this next series of the Leaders Hum interview. I am Nayan Jadeja from the peopleHum team. Just a quick introduction of peopleHum. It is an end-to-end, one-view, integrated human capital management automation platform. The winner of the 2019 Global Cody Award for HCM that is specifically built and crafted for employee experiences and the future of work with AI and automation technologies. We run the peopleHum blog and a video channel specifically targeting leaders and young leaders through our Leaders Hum series. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to welcome Alain Hunkins today as our guest. Alain is the managing director of the Hunkins Leadership Group. He's the author of the best-selling book, Cracking the Leadership Code, 3 Secrets to Building Strong Leaders. And I would personally strongly recommend people to read this book. If you look at the reviews, they're absolutely phenomenal. And over his 20-year career, he has led over 2,000 groups in 25 countries. His clients include Walmart, Pfizer, Citigroup, General Electric, IBM, GM, and Microsoft. He has designed and facilitated seminars on numerous leadership topics, including team management, conflict management, communication, peak performance, engagement, and change. He serves on the faculty of Duke Corporate Education and has published over 400 articles on leadership. His work has been featured in numerous magazines, including Business Insider and Chief Executive. Alain, very, very happy to have you on this series, and thank you for taking the time.
You're most welcome. I'm really excited for our conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, as I was mentioning, I strongly recommend people to reading your book. Would be very curious to kind of understand what was really the inspiration for you to write this book.
Sure. So it's interesting. Some people think of book writing as this act of, oh, I want to write a book. I'm going to sit down and kind of outline what I want to do. Kind of that kind of top-down approach. This book was actually written much more kind of bottom-up, grassroots, in that I've been working with leaders, as you said, for over 20 years. And what I've noticed is that there are, when you spend enough time, you get more and more data points and examples, you start to see patterns of behavior. And what I saw were these patterns emerging, that it turns out that all of the best leaders have patterns of behavior in common. And so do the bad ones. They have patterns of behavior in common of what they do poorly. And so I started taking notes and capturing these different stories and specific examples, because I know what brings lessons to life best are stories. And so the notes turned into blogs, and I started blogging with these stories in a blog called The Business of Behavior in 2011.
Wow.
And those blogs kept growing. In 2013, I committed to publishing one blog every week, and I wouldn't miss a week. And I did not miss a week for over 4 years. So 4 years later, I have over 200 blog posts.
Wow.
And I went back through them and I started looking for some common themes. And what I noticed were there were 3 overarching fundamental themes that come out time and time again around leadership. And these became the 3 secrets to building strong leaders, which is the subtitle of the book. And those 3 themes are connection, communication, and collaboration. So those were the themes. And so that's how the book emerged. And the reason that I wanted to share these stories and the principles and the behaviors was, in theory, leadership is simple. In theory, everyone I know who's a leader says, I want to do a good job. But all the data would say it's a lot harder than it looks. In fact, only about 23% of people believe their leaders lead well. So what I wanted to do was share not just here's a list of how-to tips, But let's also take a look at what is the mindset that it takes to do these behaviors, and let's take a look at what are the stumbling blocks, the pitfalls that you will fall into, the traps that happen time and time again, and share those with people. And by having all of those laid out clearly, not only do you have a roadmap, you also have a cautionary roadmap of don't go down these roads because this is where a lot of people go. And my entire hope for this was to accelerate people's learning curve and help them become the leaders that they aspire to be. I believe there are a lot of very smart high achievers who want to make the shift to becoming high achieving leaders. And those are the people that I'd like to work with.
I see. Got it. Very, very interesting. So, yeah, I think, I mean, I do remember, you kind of, and I've listened to a few of your other interviews as well, where you talk about, connection with empathy, communication with authenticity, and kind of collaborating with transparency, right? So
Yes.
if you don't mind, could you just elaborate a little bit, and would you place all three of them at an equal footing in terms of importance for a working?
It's interesting. I love the question around would I put those all on equal footing, because already just the question is starting to get us into this sense of that there's a kind of a right way and a wrong way, and around analysis. And what's great is as leaders, yes, we want analysis and we want synthesis. So I would put them on equal footing in that they are all important. However, they're also interdependent, and I do have a strong um, belief that one is the most vital, that sets the foundation for the other two. But that being said, you can't do any of them without all three on a certain level. So I'm happy to illustrate a little bit more. So the fact is, connection, communication, collaboration, these are the heart of human-centered leadership. Because let's face it, we live in this high-tech age, the age of knowledge work. What has not already been outsourced, automated, turned into some kind of an algorithm? Those are the essence of what is human work. So that has to do with not just creative problem solving, but rallying people to some kind of shared purpose and mission and working to achieve that. So for me, leadership isn't about a job title. I don't care if your name is, your senior manager analyst. It doesn't, like, that's a job title. Leadership at its core is a relationship between a person who chooses to lead and a person who chooses to follow. And the quality of that relationship is inextricably linked to the quality of the connection between those two people. And I know that sounds basic, but that is so important in this knowledge work age, because what all of the science has shown is that how people feel profoundly influences how they perform, especially when it comes to solving problems. Now, it's one thing if you're living in 1915 and you're working on an assembly line doing repetitive manual labor where the boss has said, please leave your brain at home. We only want a pair of hands. But in our world, that doesn't work. And so creating connection, and the foundation of that is empathy, that is showing people that you understand them and care how they feel. So that is the core of building this leader-follower relationship. So now that we have established the relationship, and that's the one that I think is the most important, because without that, you really don't have anything to build off of. But assuming you've built a strong foundation of connection, then what are we trying to do together? We're trying to solve some kind of problems. And whether it's for our customers, whether it's internal, we're trying to creatively solve a problem. And why communication is so important there is because communication is the platform for creating shared understanding. So I might think the problem is one thing, but if you have a different point of view, perspective of what you think the problem is, we're not going to be aligned on what sort of decisions we should take to take action and then create results. So for me, then communication is essential to creating that shared understanding. And the onus is on the leader to make sure that everyone is walking away aligned with shared understanding. Then once we have that, great. Now we know what we're trying to achieve. How do we do that? We need to create the optimal environment for collaboration. The fact is, if we as leaders say, you must collaborate, all you're doing is resorting back to what we'll call the old school command and control method of leadership. So ideally, what leaders are doing today in this knowledge work age is realizing we want to invite and enroll people in by creating an environment that is so attractive that people ultimately motivate themselves. And we do that through meeting certain of their basic human needs. We all have a need for safety. So leaders create a world that is both physically and psychologically safe, where people feel safe to speak up and know that their voice is heard. That people work in an environment where there's energy. The fact is, people do much better when the environment they're in is energized. I mean, that's intuitive, but what are we doing as leaders to make that happen? And then what do we do as leaders to create this common sense of purpose, that people know that what they're doing contributes to a mission greater than themselves? And also, what do we do to give ownership to people so that they can take control and have autonomy and freedom? Because when people feel autonomy and make progress towards that meaningful goal, it is the number one motivator to get them moving forward. So communication, connection, collaboration, they all relate. I would start with connection, but that's a high level view of all three principles. And clearly there are lots of different behaviors we can drill down into more depth if you like.
I see. Got you. Yeah, I think my next question was more of, there are people who say, oh, that person, he's a born leader, right? Would love to understand from you in terms of how much of it do you think is kind of, you're born as a leader versus you're kind of, trained and you learn through your experiences? What's your...
Great question. Yes. So people have asked me, are leaders born, are great leaders born? And last time I checked, all leaders are born. I mean, I have yet to meet one who was never born. That being said, are the skills of leadership innate or fixed, or are they something that can be acquired? Absolutely, they can be acquired. Some people might have natural strengths that lend themselves to leading. However, to continue to progress on the path of leadership development, it's a skill that's required. And you're probably familiar with the work of Carol Dweck. She's a psychologist who's written about mindset. And she talks about fixed mindset, the belief that your traits and skills are innate. And that's just, I'm smart, I'm talented, and I just have this rooted identity. Or I have a growth mindset, which means I'm able to learn and grow and develop. Leadership development works best with a growth mindset. And so I'm a huge believer that all of these things come with not just practice and experience, but intentional practice and experience. Because experience is only useful as a learning tool if it's actually reflected on, which is why I'm sure you've had the experience, as many of us have had, which is you might meet someone who's worked somewhere for 20 years and you go, I don't think that person has 20 years of experience. I think they have 1 year of experience and they've repeated it 20 times, right? Because they haven't learned from it. Whereas other people can take a small experience, but they're so reflective and they have that growth mindset. How can I extract as many lessons from this experience as possible? And then they start to accelerate that much faster. So yes, leaders are born. We're all born. The real question is, what do we do to accelerate that path? And that's what I'm trying to help people to do, is to accelerate that path of growth.
Right. Going back to something that you mentioned earlier, right, about the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, what you said was, per some numbers, about 23% of leaders are being effective, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, where do you put the blame? I mean, is it the organizations are failing them? Is it we are not picking the right leaders? Is it that they are not getting the, we just are making wrong choices? Are they not learning? Where do you think, and how do we go about improving those numbers?
What a fantastic question. Yeah, because if we look at that state of leadership, 23%, that's pretty bad. I think we all agree that's not a very good number. Now here's an interesting thing, which is, I think, so why do we lead the way we do? Again, I'm sure 100% have good intentions, but if we look at the studies, there's that big gap between 100% want to be good leaders and only 23% are. And I actually got a great clue into where the state of leadership got to be so poor. And I actually learned this from my children. So I have two kids. My son, Alex, is now 16, and my daughter, Miranda, is 13. So I learned this about 10 years ago. So they were about 6 and 3. And the two of them, as kids do, they were goofing off in our living room. They were getting very loud. And I have to admit, Nan, I got a bit triggered in the moment. And I said something to them And I'll tell you, I'm telling you this for two reasons. Let me tell you what I told them. I said, I got triggered. I said, would you stop behaving like children? Now, I tell you this for two reasons. Number one, that is a ridiculous thing to say, right? They were 6 and 3. They were children. And number two, as soon as those words came out of my mouth, I was in shock because would you stop behaving like children was the exact same phrase my mother used to use with my brother and I when we were kids. So without even realizing it, I had unconsciously repeated the behavior of the previous generation. So I share that story because if you think, why do we lead the way we do? It's a pretty good chance we have copied the behavior of our leaders and they copied the behavior of their leaders and so on and so forth. But I was really curious, where did we start this? Who started this whole chain of behavior? Well, I did the research. It turns out it was, and you might be familiar with him, a guy named Frederick Winslow Taylor, who's considered the father of the field of management. Now, understand, this was 1900. 1911 is when his book, The Principles of Scientific Management, came out. This was based in the industrial age. And by training, Taylor was a mechanical engineer. So his perception, his worldview was that the workplace was an engineering problem to be solved. So suddenly we go from being human beings, and now we're being called human resources, right? Suddenly we become cogs in the larger machine. And the whole basis of management was separation of duties. Leaders did all the thinking, and labor, employees, did the doing. And in fact, in his book, and he says this because I could not make this up, he says, the ideal worker should be so stupid and phlegmatic in his mental makeup that he more nearly resembles the ox than any other type. I mean, you can find the book and find the passage. So that's what he said. So I think, why do we lead the way we do? Unfortunately, we have carried forward so many of the bad habits of previous generations. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of how this shows up today. Now, if you're in a typical business meeting, let's say it's a monthly gathering of a team, what is usually the first thing that you talk about on the agenda? And a little quick pop quiz of you. So what's the first thing you would talk about in your typical business meeting on the agenda?
Well, typically, I mean, the way we do, we obviously engineering and tech, so data-driven, kind of look at numbers. How did we do?
You look at the number. You look at last month's numbers, right? I mean, this is the typical thing. Almost every business in every industry says, okay, let's take a look at the financials. Let's look at our numbers. Let's look at how we're doing. So we start with the numbers first. We don't start with the people first, when in fact, the numbers are in fact a lagging indicator of the behavior of people. So one suggestion is, so many leaders, they walk around seeing their people as metric makers. They don't step and go, wow, these are not just the metric makers. These are the people who make and shape, who make or break our organization. So just thinking of it and shifting your mindset, instead of thinking about, oh, I got to focus on the numbers, I actually have to focus on the people, because it's the people who make the numbers. It's a simple change. See, I believe that so many of the challenges that we face in terms of poor leadership has to do with the mindset that we start from. And so many leaders are still operating from what we'll call the commander-in-chief mindset, whereas what we need today in this knowledge work age of complexity and all the changes going on is we need facilitators in chief who recognize that today what motivates people is not, you can't say it's your paycheck, because look, between LinkedIn and Glassdoor, people know where the grass is greener. And if all you can offer me is money, I'm going to leave. In fact, LinkedIn did this wonderful survey last year. They found the number one reason people say they look for a new job is the inability to learn and grow. So our expectations as members of society and as employees have drastically changed since the days of Frederick Winslow Taylor. And so leaders have to step back out of the busyness of the day-to-day doing and go, how am I serving the employees of today? And am I using a playbook that was written 75 or 100 years ago? Because that playbook's not going to serve me anymore.
Right, definitely. Got you. So I wanted to kind of move on to something that's obviously, top of mind of everybody around the globe right now, right? The world's grappling with the pandemic. One would say leadership is in turmoil. You're trying to move between, personal employee safety to business sustenance, employee wellness, engagement. what would your advice be to a leader on, handling this kind of not even once in a lifetime, right? It's like once in a century type of a situation. And how do you go about, prioritizing and making choices?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I've been asked this a ton because it's so relevant. As leaders, we don't get to choose our crises. Our crises choose us. And as you said, we are now in this once in 100-year moment where leadership is tested. I think it was the Stoic philosopher Seneca said, basically anyone can steer the ship when the sea is calm. It's at times like this when the waves are really rough that leadership is tested. So the first thing I go back to is realize, again, if leadership is a relationship between two human beings, first thing leaders have to do is lean into being exceptionally more human. So for example, we are all, and I'll call it a trauma. Let's face it. If you look in the dictionary, trauma is defined as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. I think coronavirus qualifies pretty, I say, yeah, okay, that's a trauma. So how do people respond in trauma? Different people respond differently. But one thing we know that really helps people in traumatic situations is normalizing their experience, which is a fancy psychological way for checking in and giving people some psychological air to say, hey, Diane, how are you feeling? And it's okay not to be okay. That the first thing is, this is not business as usual. In fact, the worst thing I think a leader can do is pretend like, the giant elephant is not in the room. Let's face it, the elephant is the pandemic and it's not going away. And if we don't name it and say, this is impacting all of us, how are you doing? Because the brain science would say that when you give people that moment of air to go, oh, actually, it's really tough. I've got a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I have to homeschool them now. On top, this is real. Just giving them that moment allows them to calm their central nervous system. And when you do that, you free up all of those neural resources that are now being held in the fight, flight, or freeze mode. And it lets that calm down, and those resources can get redistributed to the prefrontal cortex and get focused on whatever job or project we're trying to do. Until we do that, people really can't give you their full attention. They really can't do their best work. So the first thing I would say is, what is the tone, the emotional tone you are setting for your team? Then, how are you opening up the lines of communication? We talked about words like transparency before. Again, a time to be exceedingly transparent. And the fact is, so many leaders carry around this idea of the superhero myth that somehow I need to be able to predict the future. No one knows how long it's going to be before a vaccine, whether it's 6, 12, 18, 24, 36 months. So with your people, be honest. Say, I don't know what this means for you. I don't know what this means for me, but here's what we can do now. And not only here's what I think we can do now, what do you think we should do now? I have been amazed by when leaders start to open up, realize a facilitator and chief leader doesn't have to have all the answers, but by asking and drawing on the wisdom of the group, suddenly the group starts to create great answers. I was just speaking with a chief marketing officer for a big company in the United States, and in concurrence to the pandemic, they're also dealing with all of the social unrest around the Black Lives Matter movement. It's going on. And they were trying to figure out as a leadership team what they should do. And they really didn't know. And they had one of their frontline, this is a retail organization, one of their frontline store managers reached out, a woman of color, reached out and shared this story and shared her experience. And they went, great. Would you champion this? Would you start this committee? And she has actually become, her and her work and her story has become the center point of how the company is responding to that crisis. So realizing we don't have to be the solution makers, we have to be the solution facilitators. And so this goes back to connecting, communicating, and collaborating. So that all starts with leaning into becoming more exceptionally human.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Though I would be curious to, it's almost, there's not a day that goes by where you don't read like an article about, Amazon. Everybody's at Amazon and try and emulate that. And typically it's thought of as a very, customer centricity is kind of the theme, and everything revolves around that. And then there are organizations, or what you were talking about, being more employee centricity, right?
Yes.
How do you argue with somebody who says that no, it's all about the customer, just worry about the customer and you will be successful?
Well, here's the interesting thing. This is a great question, man, because you used Amazon as an example. So I'll go to Amazon because yes, when people talk about customer service and customer centricity, the example we all go to is Amazon because we all know what one click means now, right? That word didn't exist before Amazon. We know what it means. So they are held as the standard of that, right? Of terms of like customer centricity. And obviously their share price is going through the roof because let's face it, people can't go out. They're stuck in a pandemic. They want things delivered. So it's actually perfect for the Amazon Deliver business model. And at the same time, if you look at how there's been a lot of unrest in some of the Amazon factories about issues around the culture, we tend to cherry pick. This is the issue of humans. We tend to go like, oh, here's the data point I want, and I hold this up. I think Amazon is probably a mixed bag, as frankly, all of our organizations are. People ask me, what's the best company to work for? It's like, it's not so much the best company, it's there are different teams within companies. Now, that said, leaders definitely set the tone around how this plays out. So to go back to this idea, is it customer centric or is it employee centric? You have to decide, as if you are I call you the leader of your organization. Now, whether that's the kind of the department within the larger organization or you're the CEO of the entire company, what is your purpose? And be transparent and explicit. Like if your purpose is to make money, then be really clear on it and you will attract people who that's their purpose to. If your purpose is something else, then put that out, be really clear on that, and you will attract those people as well. I think we are being challenged right now, as a global society to take a look at, ultimately, is gross domestic product the only measure of success? And I think these are really tough, hard questions because at what cost are we continuing to achieve? I mean, look at the rates, for example, of mental health issues, about things like anxiety and depression going up. I mean, are we measuring that in the cost? As you know, because you're in tech and you know that it's very easy when you create numbers, even profit and loss, you can manipulate numbers to serve the purposes you want. And so making sure that you're clear. Now, what we do know is that in a service economy, the satisfaction of your employees definitely impacts the satisfaction of your customers, because your customer isn't just buying a set product, right? It's not just and we live in this experience economy. So part of Amazon's appeal isn't just the product you get, it's the experience. It's the ease of use online. It's the fact that when I buy something, they say, Alain, you might also like to look at this. And like, you're right. Because they have the AI algorithm working. So suddenly they're suggesting these other great things. So we're actually judging the experience. But what we do know is that if the customer experience is lousy, there's a pretty good chance we're not having employees creating a wonderful experience that the customers are now having a lousy experience. So look, all of the studies would say that if you focus on your employees, your customers will be taken care of. Now, obviously there's business models and tweaks to do that. But also for me, at the end of the day, take away all the stats. I just go back to what are my core values. Treating people well is a value of mine. So I would focus on taking care of my employees because they're the people who are taking care of our customers. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but I don't think it's not so simple as this or that. It's, again, as we said, leaders have to embrace ambiguity and paradox. And the answer is, I don't think an either or, it's a both and.
Right. Sure. Definitely. Okay. My last question, really. Obviously, we are facing uncertain times, right? Future, we have no idea, as you mentioned, could be 6 months, could be 36 months. So two parts. One is, what would you say to young leaders in terms of being ready and prepared to face this? And then the second is more, let's assume you were giving the commencement speech for the graduates of 2020, right? What advice would you give them as they try to figure out, getting into the corporate world?
Yeah. Wow. Great questions. That's kind of two questions for the price of one. So thanks, man. Those are great. So kind of some similar things around this. Um, we learn best by doing. So right now, our world has been so disrupted. I think there is this opportunity for new ideas, new players, new just ways of thinking and acting that might build traction. So I think and the great thing about with technology too is, like anyone with a phone is a frontline journalist and can be a movie maker. I mean, the cost of entry to so many things has gone down. I would say get clear on like what's the area you want to focus on and reach out to people. One thing I would suggest, people are more open to hearing from people. I mean, now we're not going to go into we can go the whole discussion on the best ways to network, but the world is more accessible than it has ever been in human history. So what I would suggest is, as you start to move out into the world, new graduate of 2020, is reach out with being really targeted and focused. Now, obviously, you need to do your diligence. You want to be respectful. You want to do your homework, of which there's a wonderful tool called Google. You can do lots of homework on anything you're interested in, whether it's a person or an organization or an industry. But if you do that and reach out and start to create connection with people, and not just, hey, I'm new, how can you help me? But flip the equation, because I'm a huge believer that ultimately what creates value is being of service. So if you can find someone or an organization or an institution that has some kind of a problem and you see some kind of a way to be a solution maker, reach out and frame the conversation from that point of view. And then once you do that, so you have this idea, you have this noble purpose, this mission, then you have to embark on what one of my colleagues calls the holy hustle, which is you need to follow up again and be diligent. Is that you can't expect the world's going to come beat a path to your door, that you need to continue to be persistent. And some of those doors you're going to knock, and you're going to knock again, you're going to knock again, and that door is not going to be, and you have to decide how many times do you want to keep knocking. And while you're knocking on this door and you're waiting to go back and follow up next week with another email, go and knock on this door and that door and this door. And then you will notice what starts to open up for you. You need to be proactive and take charge of your own development. And so that's the first thing I'd say. The other piece along the way is, as you're taking this path and knocking on doors and opportunities start to come, one thing that is so underutilized is, as you have these experiences and opportunities of working with other people, ask them for feedback. I think receiving feedback from others and applying it is one of the most useful ways to accelerate your leadership development. So you finish up a project with someone, great. Can I ask you, before we move on, what do you think I did well? What would be even better if in the future? Because then you start to close the gap between your intention. We talked about this earlier, right? 23% of leaders are good, but 100% mean to be good. They have good intention. So closing that gap. So what do you think went well? What could be even better next time? When you start to close the feedback gap, you will be so better served, and you will start to take light year leaps in your own personal and professional development, which, by the way, from my perspective, personal and professional development are one and the same, because you are who you are. You just wear a hat, you play a role in that role as leader. So that is my advice to the class of 2020. Live long and prosper.
Wow. Well, that was great. Indeed, an honor and a privilege, Elaine, to have you on our show. I am sure our audience is going to learn a lot. And, thanks a lot for taking the time and being patient and answering all the questions.
Oh, you had great questions, and it was my pleasure, really. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for having me.